Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's so great to have all of you here for this very important panel today. My name is Erin Corcoran. I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute at the Keough School, and we're so glad to have all of you here today. We put this panel together to provide all of you with some information, a variety of different disciplines about the child migrant crisis and recent policies of the current administration to separate children from their family members who've crossed the United States southern border in an attempt, and their justification in an attempt to deter future children and families from seeking humanitarian protection in the United States. And so I'm really excited to have such great participants here, and I wanted to just briefly introduce our panelists. And the format for today is that each of us will speak for about 10 minutes, leaving time at the end of for discussion from the audience. So we'll do Q&A at the end and encourage you to ask your questions. And so first we're going to have Father Dan Rudy, who is an associate professor of theology and global affairs, who also directs the Kellogg Global Leadership Program, provide general sort of overview of the journey of folks coming from the southern border to the United States, and just sort of to contextualize the problem. And then I'm going to provide a brief overview of legal protections that are available for unaccompanied children and coming up for the southern border. And then Lisa Koo, who is the Associate Director of Legal Services at the National Immigrant Justice Center, is going to be here to discuss the litigation strategy around the family separation policies and detention, including her work representing Mrs. L, which is the lead family reunification case working its way through the federal court system right now. And then followed by that, we're going to have Professor Darcia Navarez, and she's a professor of psychology here at Notre Dame, and she's going to be talking about the psychological impacts and consequences of family separation and in detention, children and families from that perspective. And then finally, Corey Smith, who's the Vice President of Policy Communications and Advocacy for an organization called Kids in Defense, will discuss the political landscape and legislative efforts to address this crisis. So with that, I turn it over to Father Dan.
Thanks, Erin. So I'd like to begin today by just giving somewhat of a broader context of the migration and refugee crisis. This is an area where I've been kind of working for about the last 30 years, but for about the last 10 years, I've been on the Bishops' Conference Committee on Migration. And one of the interesting parts about being on that committee is that we particularly look at areas of concern and then send out delegations to these places, whether they be the Syrian crisis or the Iraqi crisis, or in this case, the unaccompanied minors in America, and try to write policy reports to look at some creative and responses to this. So I want to share with you some findings from a visit from about 5 years ago to the Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. But I want to do so also in the context of the larger picture of the migrant journey. So I've called this Unlocking Human Dignity. Actually, also as a title from a report done by the bishops about about the immigration detention issue going on right now. But in this brief presentation, what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus on 4 main points. These are my main points of the presentation. The first is that migration is not the main problem, but it's a symptom of more fundamental issues. What's at stake underneath these is also looking at what the narratives are that drive our understanding of this issue. This gets really manipulated different ways, often for political or economic gain. But it's important to understand that migration is not the problem, but it's a symptom of deeper imbalances that are really the result of why we're moving. Second is that people, this is very important in Central America, people are not leaving their homelands, they're fleeing them. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail. Third, without dealing with human insecurity, really outside of our borders, we will not have national security within our borders. And fourthly, the solutions are not enforcement alone. Not that there's no enforcement issues that need to be looked at, but fundamentally the issues of development. So that's really one of the reasons why we've come here today, to look at some of the broader kind of dimensions of this issue, and also look at how we address the root causes of the problem and not just the symptoms of the problem. So first I want to kind of back a little bit to say that what we're seeing at our borders is actually just a microcosm of a larger picture. Some scholars today have called our own times the age of migration. And it really is one of these, if not the most defining issue of our times. The numbers alone give us somewhat of a perspective on this. There are more international migrants than any other point in history. So these are people who are living outside of their country of origin. Right now, there's about 244 million international migrants in the world. That means one out of every 35 people in the world is a migrant, and at present, there are about 65 million refugees, which is more than any time in history, including after World War II. But if we look at this even more specifically, right now, if refugees were settled in one particular place, they would be the 21st largest country in the world. And they'd be growing at 38,000 people a day, or 24 people per minute. This is something that's happening in real time and in real scale. And really, it doesn't really matter exactly what policies we enact in response to this if we don't deal with really why people are moving in the first place. But we kind of actually look at the economic migrant. Again, economic migrants and refugees are related, but they're not exactly the same. This is part of the debate, the border, part of what the legal questions that will be addressed here in a moment. Refugees are protected by a United Nations convention. They can prove that their lives are in jeopardy, and by being sent back to homelands, they'd be tortured or killed. Economic migrants are moved across borders because they're searching for work or for more dignified lives. And right now, there's no international laws that really allow people to do so without formal authorization. But if we look at moving within countries, there's a billion migrants, which is one out of every 7 people in the world. So this is just such a complex issue, such a demanding issue. But part of it, it's a very simple issue. And one of the reasons why it's simple is because dignity is really at the core of it. So I wanted to just say a word about what the bishops have been doing on this, because we have no idea about what they're doing on this. But first, if we look at the United States, up until recently, the United States have resettled more refugees than any other country in the world. And the big conference in the United States, especially through its affiliate agencies like Catholic Charities, the bishops have resettled more refugees than any other organization in the United States. If we were to just count the work of Bishops' Conference alone, it would be the equivalent of the second largest country that has resettled refugees. So the church is very involved in this for a long time. Why? Because of its significant moral issue, I think that really demands the best of our energies, and it's getting worse rather than better. The scale right now, we had a ceiling about 2 years ago to accept about 150,000 refugees. Right now, that has been actually whittled down to 40,000, and there are some within the administration that say between 0 and 1 is many. So there's a lot at stake here. And I've even said to senior White House officials, I said, look, I understand the logic and the rationale for why you think this is a good thing, but effectively you have deported the soul of the country, on this, because really when you start looking at the vulnerability of the people here, it's there you begin to see sort of the real gravitas of what's going on. There's a lot here that can be looked at, but I just want to highlight the major contours in which this issue is debated. First is this is really not just a tension between crossing borders, but it's fundamentally an issue between sovereign rights and human rights. That is the right of a nation to control its borders, but also the right of a people to migrate for a more dignified life, even without documents. Secondly, it's a tension between civil law and natural law. That is that which the state chooses to regulate its borders, but also that which drives people to feed their families and to seek safety and protection. This is one of the ironies, especially with people coming from Latin America, that actually they break the law because they seek protection under the law. It's something they don't have in their own countries. Thirdly, it's a tension between national security and human insecurity, which I mentioned. When people are at risk, when people can't protect their children, when people are threatened by gangs and cartels, when there are no juridical systems or police forces to protect people, that's going to push people to move. And lastly, this is a tension between citizenship and discipleship. So I look at this primarily as a theologian. So I say that there are kind of issues of identity and belonging that have to do with belonging to being a member of the state. But however, there are deeper questions about who we are before God and who we are in relationship to one another. In our delegation to Latin America, we were looking at this issue, and these numbers spiked. So from 2000 up to 2004, these numbers were rather kind of, she said they weren't alarming, but in 2012, they more than doubled and tripled. So they went from about 4,000 to about 12,000 to 24,000 crossing the border. now up to 50,000 children unaccompanied crossing the borders. Why is this happening? What they would say, the biggest threat with the cartels and the gangs that will really rule the country, they would say, if we join the gangs, we will die. If we resist the gangs, we'll be killed. However, if we migrate, we lose our lives. So this is the complexity and the social location with a lot of people that are crossing the border right now. One person working with my sister down there, I think she had a very powerful quote that "Si el migrante no hermano, Dios es tu padre." That is, if the migrant is not your brother or sister, then God is not your father. I think it's a very powerful way of looking at that. But in the end, Pope Francis also kind of highlights something else to think about here. He looks at this not just what's happening at our border with economic migrants. He's also been very outspoken about what this means in terms of the global refugee crisis. But one of the things he did, and especially when he made his first pastoral visit to the island of Lampedusa off the coast of Italy, he really spoke about the refugee crisis. But secondly, he really spoke about the globalization of indifference. When we're indifferent to people who lose their lives, journeys, and it doesn't affect us, then something really deep down has died within us because we become less human in the process, and we've even lost the capacity to feel. So in the end, really, the overall mission of the church is really one of solidarity. And I think this is where the bridges need to be built. Pope has said this again and again, instead of walls to bridges. But one of the ways we can build bridges, understanding the situation that people come from. So in conclusion, I'd like to say two things. One, I'd like to just say that people are not leaving their homelands. They're fleeing because the cartels threatening them, their economic conditions make it impossible to live a dignified life. And the violence makes it impossible for them to actually move forward. And so a lot of them say that even if one migrant said, I said, are you scared of crossing the border that you may lose your life? He says, I know I might die. He says, already dead where I live. He says, crossing the border, he says, there's a chance I may actually live even if I die. So this is part of a larger conversation which we're going to expand upon. But the last thing I'd like to do is show you a clip from a video that we did about 2 years ago. But this is something that I think a theme that continues. It gives you somewhat of a sense of the journey itself, and maybe somewhat of a sense of the journey that many of these migrants make on trains, and any of these unaccompanied migrants in particular do. No one in their right mind would send their kids on a journey like this, unless the conditions they're coming from were worse. So this gives you somewhat of a picture foundation, I think, for the space that many people are coming.
For some migrants, the road north starts deep Central America. Their first destination is the southern border of Mexico. From there, they make their way up to one of the towns near the border with the United States. These small towns have become staging areas for migrants as they prepare for their trek into the U.S. to link up with their family members, employers. The journey is dangerous, and it's lone shots, corrupt police preying on them. And then are the physical dangers. Many migrants travel north by freight train.
And when they jump on train, sometimes they'll stow away in a boxcar. Sometimes they'll hide themselves in between the train cars. It's very dangerous for 15, 16, 17 hours at a time, holding on to a train on for their dear life. Sometimes because of sheer exhaustion, they'll fall off the train, lose a foot, they'll lose a leg, lose an arm. A lot of them will fall off and we die.
In award-winning photos here, LA Times photographer Don Bartletti rails north through Mexico with the migrants. He photographed moments of fear, joy, adventure, and compassion.
In Veracruz, there are people who live on the track who throw food at the migrant riding atop the freight train. There was one small little mom and pop grocery store next to the tracks in Orizaba, where a teenage boy had taken the leftover from the market. And I thought that this boy was going to toss oranges and they would catch them playing baseball. But the second he lunged towards the freight car where these guys and their arms hang out. But through my viewfinder, all I saw was the blur motion of the train going by. I didn't see the most magic picture of my trip. Two hands, the migrants and the givers, just a brief brush, as if we're each communicating without words, saying, please go with God, go with peace, go with love. And the migrant on the ground freight train saying, thank you for this gift of food.
The life of the migrant is a lonely experience. Will I fall off the train? Will I be robbed or swindled? What will happen at the border? These are just a few of the questions these men think about.
There's one very special photograph in my series, Bound to El Norte. It's a picture of Santo Antonio May holding all sides on the end of a car. I was laying on top of the adjoining boxcar, looking straight down. Took one picture, and then he opened his mouth. The emotion came directly through the camera into my heart, into my soul. And Santo told me, I'm going to Canada, where I have a job as a painter. And I said, well, what were you thinking when you were holding onto the train car? And I was yelling at him because it's still noisy. He says, I was praying to my Savior. Let me pass.
Thank you.
Thank you much. So now my task is to give you all a little bit of legal framework and available protections that exist for people who are seeing some of the horrific violence, oppression that Father Grudy briefly described. One of the terms he used, the word refugee, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about that actually has a legal definition. And Father Grudy also mentioned refugee resettlement. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about what that is, how that compares to something called asylum, just to contextualize sort of the kind of protections that families might be seeking in the United States, and then also touch on two other kinds of legal protections that are available for children. The concept of refugee protection really, in a large part, comes out of the history of World War II and a recognition by the entire international community that there was an international failure to provide protection to refugees fleeing Eastern Europe during the Holocaust. And after World War II, there was an international convention that was drafted and ratified called the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. And it basically laid out the international legal definition of who a refugee is. And it also had some temporal, geographical limitations because the drafters initially thought that refugees were going to be a problem of the past, right? It's just about finding a place to relocate people who've been displaced from the atrocity of World War II. And so it only defined people who were in certain parts of Europe in a certain time period. But after sort of post-colonialism and the creation of countries and also new civil wars and new conflicts, it became evident that there needed that unfortunately the refugee problem would continue to persist, and the international community needed to reconsider the definition. And so the 1967 protocol to the convention moved those temporal and geographical restrictions, and that is what the United States signed to and incorporated it in one definition into law. And so the definition of refugee is a person who's outside his or her own country of origin or of last habitual residence, who is afraid of, has a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of 5 reasons: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So it's actually a much more narrow definition than people might think. And in order to get that status, you have to apply to individually to countries. There's also a very important provision in the conventions referred to as the non-refoulement provision, the obligation of states not to refoul individuals who are at their border who might meet that legal definition. So in addition to the U.S. signing on to the 67 call, in 1980, the U.S. Congress also passed the Refugee Act of 1980, which basically incorporated all our international obligations into domestic law. And then since then, there have been regulations and additional laws that have developed. But the heart of that definition is part of our United States law. And so when individuals who are coming, these Americans who are coming to the border, many of them are trying to avail themselves of that protection. They're asking the U.S. government to recognize them as refugees. And that process, if you are at the U.S. border, is called applying for asylum. If you're over in a third country, you're asking to come and live in the United States after you've been recognized as a refugee, that's refugee settlement. But the definition is of who qualify. A couple are just technical things. In 1996, Congress amended the immigration laws and created a process called expedited removal, which gives the authority to border protection officers at the border to return individuals who do not have valid travel documents or false documents without them having a hearing for an immigration judge. The thought is that people who don't have a right to be here shouldn't have to be able to appear before immigration judges and have a hearing. There's an exception to that, though. Anyone who comes forward and basically demonstrates what's called a credible fear of persecution, so they might be eligible to get asylum, is exempt from that expedited removal procedure, and they're supposed to have access to an asylum officer who then supposed to determine or not they have a credible fear, and if they do, they're the law entitled to go before an immigration judge and ask the immigration judge to determine whether or not they qualify for refugee status. And so generally speaking, if someone arrives at the border and they're determined to have a credible fear, they go before an immigration judge. So that's just a general overview of the law, and I answer more questions about that in Q&A. The other thing I just want to briefly touch upon too is how the law treats unaccompanied children slightly different. And it's more of a procedural difference than it is a substantive difference. Still required to prove that they meet the refugee definition. And I also just wanted to note that immigration proceedings before an immigration judge or immigration officer are considered civil in nature. And what does this mean? It means that they're not criminal. And why is that important? Under U.S. law, if a criminal defendant is facing incarceration as a consequence of conviction, under a famous U versus Gideon, they are entitled to government-funded counsel in their criminal trial. Because as immigration is civil in nature, anyone who goes before an immigration officer or an immigration judge is not entitled to government-funded counsel. That includes children. And so they are entitled to have counsel if they can afford it, or they can find to represent them on a pro bono basis, but they're not entitled to any government-funded counsel. So there are a couple of important laws and policies that have been adapted to deal with protecting unaccompanied children. As Grudy mentioned, for quite some time there has been a trickle of unaccompanied children coming to the United States. But in 2012 and 2014, those numbers grew quite significantly, in large part due to the increased violence and conflict in Central America. And I want to just give a few important, I think, facts that I think are important in considering sort of what these people were fleeing and why the numbers spiked during that time. So Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world, with the murder rate of 91.6 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. And El Salvador is the next deadliest, with 69.2 murders per 100,000 inhabitants. El Salvador and Guatemala have the largest homicide rates among children and adolescents. In 2015, more than half of those in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador were under the age of 30. El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras rank first, third, seventh, respectively, for the rates of female homicides globally. 69% victims of sexual and gender-based violence try to find safety in their own country first by fleeing to locations, but continue to experience similar levels of violence in these new locations. And so these are some of the factors that are driving children, their families, and themselves to come to the border. So who is an unaccompanied minor? And an unaccompanied minor is someone who presents themselves to a U.S. official who is without a legal guardian or parent at time. When that happens, there's a couple of different laws that apply. So first, I want to briefly touch on the Flores Agreement, but I know Lee's going to probably spend a little bit more time talking about that in the family detention context. But the Flores Agreement was a 1997 class action settlement between the U.S. government and a series of plaintiffs. The litigation was brought because there was concern that children were being commingled with adults and adult criminal facilities, and so the litigation went all the way up to the Supreme Court, but ultimately settled. There were protections that were put in place about how children, these are immigrant children, these are not children who've been convicted of a crime, these are people who are seeking protection, how they're to be treated and how they're to be housed. And so children are supposed to be given released as possible from custody to parents, legal guardians, or foster placement in that order. If they cannot be released to those places, they're supposed to be placed in least restrictive settings possible. And there's a whole other series of protections that, if they are being detained, they're supposed to follow. So any child, unaccompanied or not, is protected Flores Agreement, and the government is responsible for ensuring its commands. In 2002, when the Department of Homeland Security was created, which was the largest reorganization of the federal government since the creation of the Department of Defense, there were really important protections put in place for unaccompanied children. One of them was that children, when they were apprehended by immigration officials, then 48 hours, patient had to notify the Department of Health and Human Services of that child's apprehension if they were accompanied minor. And within 72 hours, that child had to be transferred to the Health and Human Services custody. The idea being that the person responsible for the custody of this shouldn't be the person who's bringing immigration enforcement charges against that child. In addition, Customs and Border Protection agents are law enforcement. They're not child protection service agents. Human Health and Services has more experience dealing with children. So the idea was that they should be housed with that expertise. And then in 2008, the Wilberforce Trafficking Reauthorization Bill also created enhanced protection for unaccompanied children in that legislation. It specifically required that the government try to find counsel for individuals who unaccompanied children. It also created child-sensitive procedures for dealing with children, and it all changed sort of how children apply for asylum. Is really important. So one of the things that did for children, I mentioned earlier, if you arrived at the border, you would be subject to expedited removal unless you could make an exception, and then if you met the exception, you would go before an immigration judge. For unaccompanied children, they would not be subject to expedited removal. The idea being that they not even be able to articulate a credible fear, and that we should give them the benefit of the doubt. The other thing that the legislation did was provide, instead of going for an immigration judge and bring their first refugee claim, they would have the opportunity to go before an asylum officer, again, government official, someone who's trained in asylum law, and also trained in it would be a non-confrontational, non-adversarial proceeding. And the thing that it did was it said that children who were unaccompanied, who were filing an asylum in their own right and didn't have parents filing an application on their behalf, would not go to what we call 1 year filing deadline. So one of the other things 1996 legislation did was made asylum seekers require them to file for asylum within one year, is statutorily barred from receiving that kind of protection. And then just briefly, in addition to asylum, there's a couple of other forms of relief that children and they're seeking. So one is called special immigrant juvenile status, and this is really particularly unaccompanied children. This is the idea that a child can basically be found to not have a legal guardian or parent who care for them, and so that they should, and someone else is willing to provide care and custody, whether it be a next of family, or a foster care family, or a foster system. You have the ability to go into state court and get, the state court can basically make finding that you are unable to go back to your biological, one or both of your biological parents reasons of abuse, abandonment, or neglect, and that it would not be in its interest to return to your country. Once that finding is made by a state court, you can apply for the visa and be able to stay in the United States. These numbers are small, but that is one action that's available. And the other protection is also, which was through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, are UNT visas, which are visas available for children, any individual actually who's been a victim of human trafficking, whether it's sex or labor trafficking, or a victim of certain serious crime in the United States. So that's generally the kind of humanitarian protections children and families are seeking when they come into the United States. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to Lee to sort of set the frame of the family detention crisis and the litigation. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. My name is Lise Coop. I work for National Immigrant Justice Center, which based in Chicago. We have a satellite office in Goshen, and the other hat I wear is as an adjunct professor at ND Law School. And so every semester I work with a handful of law students that work on asylum cases, often involving unaccompanied immigrant children who are living in our region and contending with a lot of these issues. What's really striking about the system that Erin just laid out for you, it's intended to protect children who are unaccompanied. So children that have come to the border by themselves, whose parents have made the decision that they need to make this trip, as Father Grudy described, because there is no future for them in their home countries, or in some instances their parents are already here. And what we saw this, and what I want to take to reflect on, is this dramatic shift in this system where these protections that were created for unaccompanied children were co-opted in this whole system where children are placed in the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement rather than in the enforcement system, was really transformed into a detention system for children who had been separated from their parents at the border. And that's a really important distinction that I think we'll discuss in a bit. The psychological difference between children being taken from their parents at the border at the point of apprehension by immigrant customs enforcement versus children who had as unaccompanied minors and otherwise went into this. And so that created some really significant challenges that are ongoing and continue to really do harm to immigrant families. And this administration, the Trump administration, inherited all of the tensions that Father Grudy described, right? All of these, high murder rates in Central America and a really difficult legal system where winning asylum without an attorney in many cases is next to impossible. But what they did with that system is really transform it into a system that left no space actually for human rights to be realized. So let's talk about what happened and how it got to this point with family separation and happened this summer. What were we hearing about in the news? And where do things stand now? And connected to that, how does that play out in our community here in North Indiana, and how are we seeing these issues? So back in March of 2017, DHS Secretary John Kelly, who's of course now the Chief of Staff, but at the time was the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, paid a visit to the border. So this is very early on in the Trump administration. And he said to a group of reporters, you know what, I think one way that we could stop the waves of migrants coming to our border, posing this threat to our communities, which of course fallacy, right, that they're being and that they're likely to do harm. He said one way we might be able to stop that would be by separating families at the border, by showing parents if they dare approach our borders without proper legal paperwork, then they're going to be taken from them. And most of the population that heard that gasped, like, of course you can't do that. And so we kind of walked statement back. Lo and behold, later, legal service providers, including NIJC and our colleagues at KIND, started to see in this network of office refugee settlement shelters, children who had arrived at the United States with their parents and had in fact been separated at the border. And so we started to see family separation increase. And it's not that it had never happened before. The degree to which it was happening was increasing at an alarming rate. And legal service providers, social service providers, activists, people started to tune into the fact that this was happening. And one of the people to whom we with whom we came was a young girl, 6 years old at the time, who entered the United States in November of this year with her mother. And her mother is Ms. L, who's named plaintiff in the ACLU's lawsuit that did, really had the impact, largely ending family separation, the degree that it had been happening. And Ms. L is a woman from the Congo. She fled with her daughter, who at the time was 5. She turned 6. She was in custody. And she fled with her daughter because they feared for their lives. They have a legitimate asylum claim. They presented themselves at the border to a border guard. They walked across the bridge, and they did what Aaron described. They had a credible fear of you. And the government found that Ms. L, yes, presented a potential viable claim for asylum. Normally, she should have been allowed to proceed with her asylum claim to be released into the United States, ordered to appear at immigration court. But what happened instead, the government kept her in Otay Mesa Detention. So this is a private prison corporation, prison in San Diego. And they held her there, and they sent her to Chicago. So this is how we got to know her, because her daughter came to a facility, an ORR shelter, where we provide legal services. So we met this little girl, and we started to realize that her mother was, in fact, she had difficulty communicating, right? She didn't speak English, picked up a little Spanish and a little Portuguese on her way through South America. And so we were trying to communicate this child and learn what had happened to her, because there was no indication given to shelter or to anyone that her mother was in the United States and was in fact in immigration detention in San Diego. And meanwhile, Ms. L was going through her own proceedings. She was appearing before an immigration judge who also had no idea that her daughter was in the country. And she was to articulate to her that she wanted to be reunified with her daughter, and she would do whatever was required to be returned to her. And she came to believe that the only way she could be returned to her daughter was requesting deportation, saying, okay, I'll go back to the Congo, and come what may. The judge asked her explicitly, will you be harmed? Past a credible fear in her, will you be harmed if you're sent back to the Congo? And she didn't say no. She said it didn't matter. She said, that's the only way that my daughter can be returned to me, then that's what we'll do. She took a deportation order, and soon thereafter, ACLU lawsuit on her behalf, and she was ordered to be released from detention by the judge. And at that point, after 3.5 months separation from her daughter, she was flown to Chicago, and she was reunified with her daughter, and they now live in a refugee shelter in Chicago. And she continues to fight immigration case, and we're representing her as we're trying to reopen her asylum matter. And the judge presented to the judge a motion that said, Judge, the only reason she took deportation is because she thought that was the only way she could get her daughter, and she was traumatized, and she was terrified. And then said, sorry, I told her she could apply for asylum, and she said she didn't want to, so I'm not going to reopen her case. So her case is now on appeal, and we're trying to fight to provide her with the opportunity to continue fight her case. But that's part of the damage of what this system has done, this family separation. So what was that program? And Ms. L's case is unique because she did present herself at the board, and the family separation, the zero policy tolerance that her loss confronts directly, claim be targeted against people who have come to the United States other than through a port of entry. So following her entry in November of last year, and her lawsuit was filed in February, her lawsuit, she's ordered released, and the lawsuit continues because the ACLU more broadly was saying, hey, you can't separate from children. They have a constitutional right to family integrity that you are in violation of through this practice of family separation. So while this lawsuit is pending, the United States government can separating families. Doing this is a part of what they're now fully calling the zero tolerance policy, where they're saying, if you dare come to the United States and you enter not through a port of entry, but you cross, over the river, through the desert, or over the wall, then to be criminally charged. So they pulled up a federal misdemeanor charge, which is a part at the AEC U.S. Code 1325. It's this. It's a federal misdemeanor again, so like a minor crime with a maximum sentence of 6 months incarceration, which was almost never imposed. He said, we are for every person who enters the United States not through entry, we're going to file charges, and we're going to impose criminal sanctions. And when we do that, because we're taking them into federal criminal custody, they can't take their children with them to jail. So we're going to send their children to ORR shelters. So this is how the ORR network that had been created to provide a safe place for accompanied children to be while they were going through their proceedings became a part of the whole family separation debacle. And so this continues, and somewhere in the ballpark, 2,500 families, more or less, were separated through the course of the zero tolerance policy. And many of those families aren't in fact crossing. I mean, many of them were because they had to, because they were fleeing for their lives, but many of them, like Ms. L, were actually presenting themselves at ports of entry. And so this whole justification for the program in with really unravels when you start to look at the specific cases that were involved. But eventually, a judge in the Southern California, in the context of the Ms. L lawsuit, said, okay, government, you've got to stop family separation, and ordered on June 26th that all the children who had been separated, who were under the age of 5, had to be reunified with their parents within 14, so by July 9th. And everybody who was 5 or older, all the children 5 and 18, or just under 18, had to be reunified with their parents by July 26th. And so, of course, from there, chaos that we all saw in the news, because there never was a system to reunite the families. And so what does this mean for the families who were caught up in this? Well, some of the parents have already been deported, we know that. And some of those parents are clients, and then the clients of legal service providers. And we're trying to figure out, is there a way to get them back into the United States, because they had legitimate asylum claims that were never allowed to put forth. So can file humanitarian requests to bring them back in. Meanwhile, their children remain in OR custody. So some of the families were reunified. We had some children from our shelters down to the border, presumably to reunify with their parents, only to find that their parents had already been sent somewhere else. So we were shipping children all over the country during the month of July, and we, being the U.S. government, attempting to reunify these families. And again, just no system in place to do it. And so it added to additional trauma and strife, confusion, and anxiety, and concern among parents that they were never going to see their children again, or that their children were going to be sent with other families or adopted by other people. Of course, rumors started to circulate among immigrant communities. And you can understand why there would be levels of concern that these irrational things might happen to their children. But so there were some that were reunified, and those families were now starting to hear those stories. Some have resettled in our area, and some of them have become our clients. And we're hearing the stories about what happened at the point when they were separated, and what they were told by border guards, and how mistreated and then threatened at that point. And some parents remain separated from their children. So we have another case that we're working on involving a woman who we're calling Ms. Q, who's a Honduran woman who fled to the United States with her then three-year-old son. He's now turned four. In March of this year, because she was targeted by a gang. She was beaten horrifically. She experienced severe gender violence, and came to the United States to seek asylum. And at the border, her son was taken from her. And she tells the story of how when were apprehended by Border Patrol, they were placed in first the hieleras, right? The ice boxes, or these really cold Border Patrol holding facilities, and then the perreras, the dog pound, where they were held in the wire cages. And she talks about how when they were in that space, her son became ill and he threw up on himself, and they wouldn't give him a change of clothes, and they wouldn't get any milk for him. And so she a clean diaper. She took his clothes, and he was at the time he was potty trained, and put him in a diaper, and he had to, wrap up in one of those toil blankets and wait to be dealt with. And sure enough, they came and then they said, sorry, we're taking your, well, they didn't say sorry. They came from her, and they sent him to Chicago, where he's been since March. She remains in detention in Laredo, because the government is alleging that she is an unfit parent because she has a criminal history. She was a single mother living in Honduras. She rented a room in a house where gang members had activity. And so she got swept up in this dragnet. And so now the government is, oh, because you lived in this house, we think you're a gang member. You're not allowed to be reunified with your child. So they remain separated. And so this is a case where we're working. She continues to seek asylum. She passed her credible fear interview. And we are trying to determine we're trying to force government to reunite. Meanwhile, her son has regressed mentally. He's not speaking. The caseworkers at his shelter tell us he does NEPers now. He's no longer potty trained. He's no longer speaking. He's refusing to talk to his mother on the phone. And so this is the type of damage that we're continuing to see. Even though technically the formal family separation policies have theoretically concluded, the damage is really ongoing, and that might be a good transition point for you to come in about some of this harm. And then the other thing I'll mention, just one last plug for the Notre Dame students. The law student recently took on a case of another family that recently arrived, Elkhart, a mother and a father and their young son, who thankfully came to the United States in late July, because otherwise they would have been separated. And they're demonstrating these same issues, the same push factors that have driven so many families from Central America, were the reasons why they became gang violence, sexual violence they experienced. I'm so proud that the law students are in a position to be able to represent that family and help them pursue protection, because otherwise they would be trying to navigate this incredibly complicated system without the benefit of counsel. So it's good that everybody is able to respond that way and continue to do so.
Good morning still. My name's Darsha Narvaez. My area of scholarship is in lifespan and moral development and flourishing. And so I look at the long-term effects of early experience. I'm going to go rather quickly through just some highlights of the kinds of things we're looking at in my lab. So I'd like you to take a few deep breaths right now. Get your attention focused. I'm sure some of you, maybe all of you, have seen videos of reunions of children and their parents, their mothers often, from the past few months. Many of those children don't recognize their parents. And these videos show, for example, a baby crawling away mother. A 3-year-old, the mother says, he doesn't know me anymore. 7-year-old can't sleep through the night. So what's going on? What do we know about human development? And I'm just going to really, like I said, go fast. Right, so we have to understand who we are as creatures. We're animals, certainly, but we're a special kind of animal. We're social mammals. We need certain things to grow well. So young children need to play, or else their executive functions don't grow well, and they don't along as well. They need lots of physical affection to grow their bodies and their brains well. Bonding. Because we are biosocially constructed. We're born 8 months early compared to other animals, and so lots of things still have to be finished up after birth. We only have 25% brain at full birth of the adult volume, and so lots grows in the first year, the second year, age 6, and even we know now, neuroscientists, we're not really adults till about age 30. So there's lots of effects of experience on who you are and who you become. What has evolution provided? What has God provided for us to develop ourselves well? Well, the evolved nest. The animal has one species typical developmental system that matches up with a maturational schedule of the, and when you provide that developmental system, you have a species typical outcome, a well-functioning creature, smart and effective. What's our nest look like? That's what we studied in my lab. So this is for young children, especially soothing natal experiences, so birth experiences that don't traumatize the child. So no separation from mother, no infant circumcision, no painful procedures. That's what our heritage is. All these things, if you violate them, back to your brain development, your body development. And I'll show a couple illustrations in a moment. And so you're not on the trajectory for human nature that we evolved to have. Touch, I'll talk about in a moment, but there's epigenetic effects happening here. That means your genes are being turned on or off, or how they're going to express themselves throughout your life. Are there a sensitive period for that? So for touch, we know that in the 6 months or so of life, if you have lots of affectionate care and touch, turns on genes to control anxiety. If you pass that time, little touch or distress, those genes get turned on properly, and so for the rest of your life, you're going to be anxious with new things. You're going to be with strain events. And the only way to cure it is with drugs, right? You have to take some self-medicate. Responsiveness, this is a well-studied one in psychology. Having caregivers who respond to your needs to keep you calm as a baby, keep you in an optimal kind of state of arousal. Breastfeeding, this is a shocker, 2 to 5 years is what our brain and body needs as the immunoglobulins you need to build the system, which is finished till about age 6. All parents, other mothers. This is not a mother's only kind of nest. It's provide the community, lots of free play, self-directed play. That's where you learn how to control aggression, get along. It's a social support. So you feel like you're cared for, like you belong. All these things matter from a neurobiological perspective, and they're all related to self-regulation in various ways. This heritage, these experiences in early life, lots of caring, touch, holding, responsiveness. What happens now when you don't have touch? Well, we need it to grow. When you don't have physical touch as a baby, your DNA synthesis slows down, your growth hormone slows down, and it causes all sorts of disruption in multiple systems that are growing rapidly at that time. So we can have lifelong changes in stress responsiveness. It can be hyper stressful, new things, or easily go into that stress mode. And when that happens, the blood flow shifts in the body. It draws away from your higher order thinking and capacities, mobilizes you for action, flight, fight, right? If you can run away. And if that doesn't work, then start to slow down and freeze or faint. But know that if you routinely stressing a child, they're going to go into more of a stress reactivity. And I'll show you a little bit later. You have all sorts of mental illness, physical ill health as a result of these kinds of experiences. We know pain response increase. We know that the opioids that we carry in our bodies, which are intended to kind of get into people and relationships, those things decrease. Oxytocin capacities, the huddle hormone decreases, and the lasting, as I said, epigenetic effects. So we can see here brains on the left side is a 3-year-old's slicing size. You can see on the right, a neglected 3-year-old brain. And what's lacked usually refers to a lack of touch and attention or responsiveness. And what gets affected then is not only brain size, but all these systems as well. As I mentioned, the stress response, immune system, endocrine systems, neurotransmitters, your emotions develop and how they work, corpus callosum, which unifies the two halves of the brain. I could go on and on for hours talking about these. So what happens is the child then develops this sense of not feeling it, right? So the feeling of, just from Jean Leloff, a great book, The Continuum Concept, the feeling appropriate to infinite arms is feeling of rightness, essential goodness, that he is right, good, and welcome. Without that conviction, a human being of age is crippled by a lack of confidence, a fullness of self, of spontaneity, of grace. Responsive care is part of that building of self-confidence and grace that we really reflect in our uniqueness as images of God. And responsive care establishes various brain and emotional regulation patterns, trajectories. And the responsiveness means you have a caregiver who's synchronizing their communications with you as a child. So we call that limbic resonance, part of the brain, regulating and having an external umbilical cord in a way, or in a womb, especially in those first 18 months, 2 years. For example, the vagus nerve, it's the 10th cranium, runs through all the major systems of the body. It's established well with good responsive care. And it's related not only to the ability to be intimate with others, and have all systems work well, your brain, your heart, and so on. But it's also related to compassion. People who have nerve that works well, base nerve, are more able to express compassionate. response. Part of the reason for the going on in early life is the right hemisphere is rapidly developing, more so than the left hemisphere in early life, and it's dominates self-regulatory systems, ability, emotional intelligence, empathy, beingness, self-transcendence, and so on. All sorts of intelligence that now we know in our country are lacking in many kids coming to school. So what happens normally with the brain development and is born with these survival systems that keep you alive, and you do good executive functions, those abilities to control those survival systems, and spend your life in the pro way of getting along with others, as you see this centered imagination. But with early tough stress, so this is generally in the first 6 years of life. Or if you have trauma later, like this is a PTSD kind of brain response. This is what happens. As I mentioned, the stress response kicks in, floods with self-centeredness, right? Because you don't feel safe and you get safe, and you do whatever it takes. And if this happens in early life, the stuff that's supposed to be growing in this social capacities to care and love, play, and be interpersonally dancing, don't develop properly. And so you spend your life with a personality more like this. And it looks like either one up or one down, dominance or submission. You can't control it because you've been conditioned to go into this fight, flight, freeze, faint orientation. And then your imagination, your ability to think about possibilities and abstract, go to viciousness or just dissociates from your emotional capacities. So we've looked at, just one last slide here, we've looked at the effect on adults of their early nest experience. We find negative patterns, didn't have a good nest, you're attached, which is a reflection of how well your neurobiology works, is poor. You have worse anxiety and depression. Your interpersonal capacities are diminished. You can't take perspectives as well, or you get personally distant with others, and so you can't think very well, and you're very, very closed-minded or closed-hearted towards others. But the good news is that when you provide the nest, you get good, secure attachment, good mental health, better perspective taking, and you're more relationally open and attuned. If you want to read more about this, the book that's circled there, Neurobiology and Development of Human Morality, is won a couple prizes, including from Pope Benedict's foundation. But it's something we all need to pay attention to, is caring for babies and children, my passion, and I hope it will become yours. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Thanks to everyone for coming out today and the organizers. How many of you have watched this over the summer unfold with family separation? Just raise your hands. There is obviously a real need for you all to be involved. And what I hope is that after this, and I'm sure some of you have been involved in contacting members of Congress, donating, things like that. But I just want to talk about some of the things that you can do, I think, that will make a real difference. I think there's a danger of feeling overwhelmed by this situation and that the problems are intractable. The good news is they're not. And, to give you an example of what's like Aaron and Lisa talked about with the legal framework is, I've been doing this since I was on trafficking, but I've been doing the unaccompanied child work for kid defense since 2014, when last crisis has happened, a huge surge of unaccompanied children. And I would say every month there's been an attempt, Congress and by the administration, roll back the due process protections. This is the TPA. There's probably been, I don't know, they're not creative, right? They don't get original in what they do. So we know their playbook, and we have thwarted them, stopped and blocked them each and every time. And so those TVPA protections still exist. I think that's something that's important to know. And one of the reasons that happened is with the Senate. As you know, or probably know, that the Senate has a 60-vote threshold to make changes to legislation. The current configuration of the Senate is 51 Republicans, 49 Democrats. I do think that it's likely that Republicans will gain a few seats in the Senate at least, but we are able to keep them from that number 60. And so in mind that there's been many attempts to roll back the due process protections for these children, which were embodied again in a Trafficking Victim Protection Act that was passed 2008, passed in a bipartisan unanimous vote again. So that's how different things have become. There's a couple bills that are out there that are very good that could be extremely helpful. One of which is the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act. That's in the House and Senate. That would provide counsel for children. As Aaron walked through, there is no right to kill for children. Every month, my organization's attorneys see toddlers in immigration alone against a trained government attorney. And it's not an exaggeration, right? So there's the bill, Fair Day in Court for Kids Act. Can pretty much guarantee that Senator Donnelly is not on that bill, nor the Republican senator. But I think that those bills are important. It's a bill that's going to continue to be part of the conversation in the coming years. So the Fair Day for Kids Act. The other bill that's going to be coming out, hopefully any time now, I wanted it to be out summer, is a bill called the Central American Reform Enforcement Act. That bill is really important because what it's going to do is it's going to provide a framework on how to address root causes. So a lot of what I talked about with root causes, the sex and gender-based violence, the gang violence, the corruption, there is a lot of attention to root cause, and that's really the best solution in some ways for this issue. I've worked on immigration reform for 15 years now. I'm amazed that 98% of legislation policy dealing with the immigration system and the American system is active. Here's a real opportunity to do something proactive. You talk to individuals that come here because they have no choice, flee or die. We've heard this. They would love to stay in their home country. They have no choice. And so what this bill would do is address the root causes of the gang violence. Address the femicide, the sex-based violence. It's the incredible violence that's going on that the state is unwilling or unable to protect their citizens. And so that again is going to be introduced sometime in the next weeks. It's the Central American Reform and Enforcement Act. It was originally called the Secure the Northern Triangle Act. It was introduced about 3 years ago. And again, it's a roadmap for how to spend funding to address root causes of violence. And that funding started under President Obama. It was around $750 million. It's always been viewed as a multi-year effort. I think most recently it's shrunk down to $400 million. It still exists under a called the Alliance Prosperity. But again, the budget for the Health and Human Services HCC program for this year alone is $1.3 billion. And they need more money for that. They'll either need money to be transferred, need emergency funding. We're talking in 1 year, 4 times the amount for the HHS Health and Human Services program versus root causes. So the funding is also really important as well. I think that root causes really want folks to think about that as you look at the crisis and address that issue through these legislative vehicles or through funding. I think the other big challenge we have on a policy front is the administrative measures, what the administration can do through policy, and that is that's our area of greatest vulnerability. My organization came out with a report a couple months ago called Death by 1,000 Cuts. It catalogs all the different policies. I don't have time to go through them now, but I do encourage you to look at it. If you don't have time to read the report, we actually have a little timeline that shows significant policy changes that are occurring on our website. So it's a helpful kind of critique to look at. That's why litigation is important, right? You have the House, Senate. The administration currently is Republican of one party. Do have that one check with the courts, and frankly, right, you litigate it early and litigate often. That is what needs to happen, and that's really the best tool that we have to try and check some of these policies that are being put forward. So I think funding is important. The due process protections are important. Trafficking Victim Protection Act is important. I also want to emphasize, I'm going to be short because I know we've long lots of time, hopefully lots of time for questions. But the other thing is this crisis this summer, it's all deliberate. It was created. That's not conspiracy. It's not infoil. All these measures are orchestrated to create a crisis and to crash the system. That is absolutely clear to me. They held children longer in more restrictive settings. They subjected the sponsor to come forward to get children to check-ins, to background checks. Obviously, sponsors, most overwhelming majority, at least 90%, don't have status. So what sponsor is going to come forward with this administration? So you have greater and greater strain put on the system, greater and greater policies like family separation, which was absolutely deliberate, completely intentional to do, and it's in the message. It's what? The last number I've seen a month ago was that the numbers haven't changed at all. Why? Because when people are fleeing death or harm to their families, if you take your family and you get from Indiana to Georgia, and you knew that you may have a chance to be saved and the journey was dangerous, who would not do that? If you could protect your mother, your father, your siblings. It's going to keep going on until the conditions changed. And despite the cruel policies that were completely intentional, nothing will change. The conditions on the ground change. So I think I just want to make sure. I mean, I think the other thing is doing op-eds, doing letters, talking to media, donating groups like NIC, like Catholic Charities. I think all those things are extremely important. The one thing I would encourage is, not to just simply post on social media, we are better this, or thought and prayers. Now, appreciate the intent, but I think with the situation now, we need more action, and folks need to really make sure you're weighing them with your members. Last thing I'll say on the political landscape again is that the Senate, I think we'll win Republican control, and the Senate will likely gain Republican. As you all followed, there's a lot of talk that the House would like gain Democratic seats and enough Democratic seats to be Democratic majority in the House. I like checks and balances. I like balance, regardless of a political affiliation. If that happens, I don't overstate, though, the ability to oversight. They can have oversight. I think the big impact that the House could have when Democrat is to use the power of the purse with thing to rein in some of the enforcement activities, to work on eliminating the detention beds, things like that. But I also overstate the ability to affect change, particularly with this situation, which seems to be above shame, above reproach in many different ways. Unlike the previous Republican administration, there was challenges on immigration with the George Bush administration. There was a shaming. There was ability to work with them and people that cared that remained in the administration. Here, it's either they've been removed and marginalized. So I do think it's going to be important, obviously, to have the House's change is significant, but I also think it's going to take a lot of continued work, and I think a lot of engagement on your part, and I think legislation, funding, engagement, things have real teeth. I also think changing the frame of the debate. We've been working on make this more about children, child welfare, children's rights, taking out of just the immigration lens, since that's so contentious. Again, not ideal, but this is a situation we're currently in. And so we're looking for ways to impact public consciousness, impact the public. I also think there should be work on more benevolent nationalism for this country. The values for this country that are positive and good. And where there needs to be a counter to this new white nationalism that is occurring, where it's very anti-immigrant. And there needs to be a response where there's more positive, benevolent values with nationalism. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So, is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. This is now an opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions. So I've got mic that I can round to people who want to ask questions of the panelists. Sure.
Afternoon. I'm Noelia Rodriguez. I'm an immigration attorney. I volunteered to Delhi at the end of the Obama administration in 2016. I think following up on what Mr. Smith was about, more of like the political side of things, I wonder if you comment on who's making a huge profit out of the family detention practices. How does this affect incentives and priorities in enforcement operations? And maybe Lisa Coop can jump in and talk about What would you say are the adjudicatory inefficiencies and inconsistencies, whether new or exacerbated under current administration, and how do these deficiencies affect taxpayers?
Thanks.
Yeah, does this work? Can you hear me? Yeah. I think that, yeah, this has been something that's been well documented on the detention facilities. And I'm blanking right now various names like CCA and other Core Civic. Yeah, you guys know. So it's an absolute reality, and I think a big challenge. And I think that one of the things that I wanted to mention in time, but there was, for example, a pilot program that used alternatives to detention, the Family Case Management Program, which was established in January 2016, and it ran until the Trump administration canceled it in June 2017. It was extremely cost efficient, much cheaper than family detention. Obviously, with all the upsides of not having detention, and also had post-relief service. And the real big selling point for Republicans in particular was you had a 99% appearance rate and immigration hearings, and 9.4% attended their appointments with ICE. And so it's not only that it's cheaper, but it's also effective. And there's a lot of good programs for alternatives to detention that I know we just didn't have time to discuss the scope, but I'll leave it at that, Lisa.
Sure. And I think it is worth mentioning, and we have some of us here today that did a lot of work pushing back against the efforts of CCA, now relabeled Core Civic, to bring an 800-bed facility to Elkhart County last fall. So that was, again, credit to the community to come together and push back against that and recognize that additional detention space is reflective of our values, either as a country or as a community. In terms of the inefficiencies, I mean, again, I think this concept of death by 1,000 cuts, is really apt comes to what's going on in the immigration system. I'll say, related to the asylum case, unaccompanied children's cases, the backlogs in the immigration court are really significant for us here in Chicago. We are requesting hearings as quickly as possible because clients, when they have asylum cases, they want to go forward. When they have attorneys, they want that resolved. They want to have protection. They want to be able to extend their protection to their derivative family members. And we can't get our cases before an immigration. In Chicago, the early hearings we're getting are somewhere in 2021. Are just recently told us that under orders now to schedule three asylum merits hearings a day. So your hearing previously would be either at most 4 hours to put on a full asylum trial to establish that you win asylum. An immigration judge in San Francisco is like, trying a deathly case in traffic court. It's not enough time. So now adding to that we're going to have in some instance 2 hours or less to do a full asylum trial is just really inadequate, and I think will create additional efficiencies because you really do cross violations where people have an opportunity to fully present their case. So I think that's just going to ultimately create more appeals into the Board of Immigration Appeals, into the federal courts, and just choke up the system more.
One question too. Well, I'd love to hear from you all later, but I don't know if anyone, congratulations on your work in there. I think that's incredible, and I just moved and saw that. Has that happened anywhere else? I mean, is this kind of neat? I mean, that was like the one bright spot I'd seen in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, Richard Aguirre set up a bunch of others. I'm sorry if I'm neglecting other people that are present today that were really hard on those campaigns. CCA, ICE has been requesting bids for facilities in the Chicago area for the last couple of years. So I think there have been, Richard, 6 efforts to build facilities right now. There's possibly proposed in the works in Newton County. So there's, if we're talking about concrete ways that people can get involved, supporting the F there and on the grassroots community organizing to push back against, I think it's Geo that's contemplating a facility in Newton County, which is west of out in super rural Indiana. That's a place where we can plug in.
Thank you for such an insightful panel. I was wondering that in light of Sessions state that he wants to reject asylum applications for women in particular from the triangle countries on the basis of domestic violence, gang violence, how that affected like Ms. Q, or is that going to happen? What are the legal implications?
So you're referring to the Attorney General has authority, not unbridled, I would say, but has authority to certify cases to himself and issue precedent decisions. And what he did this summer was issue a decision called Matter of AB, in which he made a whole lot of noise about trying to shut down asylum for survivors of domestic violence, survivors of people fleeing non-state, so violence by non-state actors. So essentially looking to shut down gang-based asylum claims. I mean, what we're seeing nationwide is that some judges are reading that decision to mean they can't grant asylum in many of those instances. And certainly, as we said, we need to litigate these cases. There will be a lot of appeals from those. I don't think that has the authority to do he's suggesting he can do. I don't think his decision goes as far as it's been interpreted as going. If you're interested, we wrote a practice advisory on how people should be interpreting Matter of AB, and that's at immigrantjustice.org. But the takeaway, the message that percolated out from that was a very strong message to immigrant communities that you can't win asylum fleeing domestic violence. That's absolutely not the case, but certainly it's much more of an uphill at this point.
Hi, so my name is Valerie. I actually worked at DCA and visited Stewart Detention Center. For those of you who don't know, it has the highest rate of deportation out of all of the immigration detention centers in the nation. But I witnessed the LOP program, the LOP program. A lot of the due process responsibility fell on the immigrants, and they weren't necessarily entitled to legal representation. How translate into families? I know exactly. I don't know exactly how. I know the children have to represent themselves, but is that a neglect of civil liberties or civil rights? And how can we push that to change?
And LOP is legal orientation proceedings, correct? I don't know if you want to say program. Sorry. Does anybody want to say a little bit about it for the audience? I don't work.
Sure. So LOP is a legal orientation that legal service providers in some instances are authorized to do at immigration detention centers, where, for example, NIJC into a couple of the in the Midwest a couple of times a week, and we bring to everybody before they go, and we give them a legal orientation. It's not appointed counsel. It's not the thing as having an attorney. It's orienting people the legal process. And then from there, you can't use your legal orientation funding. There's no federal funding for this, but from that, might identify cases that other attorneys would then come in and provide representation. But what you're asking about, how do families and children, and that's adult detention centers like Stewart. The bill that you're talking about appointed counsel for kids is responsive to really severe gap. Kids get the equivalent in children who are in Office of Refugee Settlement custody, the equivalent of a legal orientation program for children. We have charts where we talk about how the immigration court proceeding is like a soccer game. So we try to make it, something that children can conceptualize, which to some degree is sort of absurd, right? Because 4 or 5, 6-year-old isn't going to understand what's going on in court, but they do have children in ORR custody. Again, that's Office of Refugee Resettlement. Get these orientations. They get legal screenings. We're allowed to some degree accompany to court and provide some level of representation, but that's not the same as appointed counsel for kids going through the system. And so the bill that you were mentioning is really responsive to that gap.
Yeah, and I think one thing too, I want to comment on the backlog. It's horrible. The challenge that because we used to work to support funding immigration judge teams to help eliminate the backlog. But the fear we have now is that with this administration's ideological and anti-immigrant, what kind of people do we get, and what do we do? I mean, it's just like, it's a real problem. We've talked about having report language, which is language that attaches to the power of the funding to provide certain conditions for hiring, but it's not going to get through the Republican majority, and so it's a real challenge right now because it's a huge problem but then we're in a bind where we fear the kind of judges that would come in and be very, very, hostile to, like Atlanta. I mean, there's a huge difference in where you appear and the kind of judges you experience if you're not familiar with that. So.
I mean, the only other thing I think too, with respect to the judges, is that there's also been a lot of pressure by the administration, the Department of Justice, to create whether how you're evaluated and your performance is evaluated on how many cases that you complete. Yeah. And there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to basically be requiring judges to get to a certain decision in a case. But these are civil servant judges that are under tremendous pressure now and face losing their job, being reprimanded if they don't do cases. And so that's another sort of procedural assault that's made on immigration judges.
I'm Kate McCrum. I'm a visiting fellow at the Kroc this year, and I love the interdisciplinary nature of this panel approach this problem from so many angles. The one thing I wish we could as a historian, and I feel that way because I think that sometimes when we talk about, we risk externalizing the violence that you're talking about, and talking about gang violence and corruption in Latin America as inherent to Latin America. And I see you nodding. I know you think about this a lot. And so I worry about risking for the students in the room reifying Latin America as violent and corrupt, and the U.S. then as potential savior, right? So I wonder if any of the panel could speak a little bit to the role of U.S. policy, economic policy, foreign policy, immigration policy, and help to create and exacerbate gang crisis and the action that you're talking about, because I think that would affect then the nature of the legislation that we advocate for, whether it leaves that problem untouched or keeps challenges it. Right?
I'll just start real quick, and I mean, part of what I do, I view the root cause as also the U.S. responsible for a problem that helped create, because what happened in the 80s with immigration is you put non-violent immigrants into prison, violent prisoners. They form gangs for protection. This is historically something you see with different minorities and ethnic groups. Then they were deported back, MS-13, and it was basically sending back a virus in a lot of ways of a gang that was powerful. And the state also been decimated by civil wars and conflict, and the state was, you see a lot now. It's interesting because we're on human rights. You have a problem now where non-state actors are much stronger than the state. You certainly have a problem where there's authoritarian regimes, have all sorts of abuses, but you also have problems with whether it's terrorist groups, drug cartels, trafficking groups that are more powerful than the state, and that started with the immigration policy in many ways in the U.S. and was exacerbated by the deportation of those individuals back, plus the war and the Civil War and the Cold War and things like that. So I don't know if you.
This is not my area of expertise, but I agree that we need more, even deeper history than the 80s, because Britain and the U.S. have meddled in Latin America for decades, not centuries. And so I think we also look at capital as being imposed on communities that were working fine, but then the IMF, World Bank, I mean, all the influences is taking away the commons from people just making their livings and all. And that's, you have all these people displaced. So, I mean, that's still happening all over the place. So, yeah, anyway, but that's not my area, but someone else probably knows more.
Hi, I'm Elena Stavreska, also a visiting fellow at Kroc. I appreciated that you all brought up the concept of dignity and the importance of it as we of this matter. And I especially appreciate Erin's overview of how the legal understanding of refugees has evolved. So I wanted to turn my question back to the second part of the title, the just peace part. Do you see there any evolution be likely in problematizing this distinction between refugees and economic migrants, or maybe even climate change migrants, which we are likely to see? Because then there's this assumption of what constitutes violence. And those people, the economic migrants, actually do have a choice. So choice, hunger or migrating, is that a choice, and so on. So kind of, my question, I don't know, I guess is to in mainly, but anyone is welcome to respond to that. Whether you see any discussion around this, because I don't know international law, and whether there's an evolution likely to happen on this front as well.
Part of the global compact on migration, which is that has been a huge issue in the past year or so, but the U.S. chose not to participate in. Basically, looks at sort of the more larger meta issues around migration. And I mean, I will say, from my professional perspective, one of the things that was always challenging doing refugee and vulnerable populations as advocacy. There is a tendency to sort of to show the distinctiveness in order to show the vulnerability in order to get protection, creates this dichotomy of sort of place them in different places, as opposed to sort of on a continuum. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about sort of forced migration as a concept to understand, and forced meaning necessarily, but would include things like climate change, and would include things like poverty. And economic instability. And I think if you look sort of, for example, at the African Organization of African Unities recognition of 1969, they actually fold those rights and is definitionally into part of it constitutes a refugee. So there is, I think, some criticism about the refugee definition itself, and that it's very sort of the North and Western understanding. And your classic refugee is a male political dissident who's being put in prison for. I think in some ways the work that's been done with respect to sort of gender-based violence and some of these sort of novel claims around is sort of we expand out definitionally who we understand to be a refugee. I still don't think answers the question of does it matter if someone a refugee or versus migrant, and I think there is being work done nationally to address sort of how do we understand migration and sort of the continuum of migration. And I think it's a really important question, and I think it becomes it's a tough thing when you're doing policy ask. But I think it's a really important point. So thank you. I think we've got time for one more question.
My name is Richard Aguirre, and I founded and co-led the coalition that did the Elkhart County Immigration Detention Center. And the I have is for Father Grudy, which was that in Elkhart County, faith and moral grounding was key to the coalition's success, but also was showing that all sectors of the community, including business, benefited migrants, and that creating an atmosphere of reject or fear for migrants would drive away not only undocumented folks, but also legal immigrants who would not want to live in that kind of atmosphere. The glimmer of hope that I see in the country is, by and large, the community, including those evangelicals who will overlook anything negative that the Trump administration does. But on immigration, there seems to be more of them who are opposed to the current family separation policies and some of the harsh policies when it comes to asylum. My question is, why hasn't there been a stronger push by the Catholic Church, which morally is not in a great position right now, but to lead this coalition of faith to stop this kind of onslaught on human rights?
Well, I have this my experience being on this committee that they have been doing a lot, but they're not real good at marketing it yet, and they're real good at communicating it. And so I think it's important to understand that they're doing a lot of behind the scenes work, from lobbying to trying to influence legislators, to a lot of service histories. I'd like to see it verified, but someone once pointed out a fact to me. They said half of all the migrant and refugee relief work in the world is done by the Catholic Church. So I do think there's a lot more the bishops need to do on that. And I think this is really a very important kind of place to really work out mission. But I really will say this. I think there are people on this board here who are experts in policy. But one of the areas where the battle we fought is on the level of the nation and on the level of the heart. And I think we need to do is rewire the motherboard of how we even think of this issue. Right now, there's two competing narratives primarily that are really at play. One is that we're nations of immigrants. The other is we're country laws. And I think this country laws is really trumping really what is. But to point out the moral hypocrisy of this, for Trump to really change migration, and then to his parents kind of through this. I mean, even at some point, you're like, even this doesn't even look right. So I really think lots at play into the narrative that you use to govern our imagination in this, where I think the religious community and particularly play a role, not in advocating on the line and in the streets. in the courtrooms and other places, especially with trying to reshape the way we think about what migration is about. One area where that can be done is just even thinking about Jesus himself. He was, and I maintain that he wasn't a legal alien from the very beginning. He was illegal in the sense that he was born outside Locke. He's an alien, in fact, he was from another world. So in this sense, he was born. If you go into Bethlehem now, there's a big wall right between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. The manger sets that some of the vendors we sell a wall, in the manger set to actually show that if Jesus was migrating today, or if his parents were migrating, or if the Magi were migrating, they wouldn't get in. So I think that should disturb us, and I think it is to unsettle the imagination a bit, so that we can reframe the light of human dignity, human rights, kind of the core issues at stake in terms of our existence.
I wanted to say one thing, as I've thought of this, and I have to give a lot of credit to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Catholic Charities, in my work in D.C. over the years. And I'll say this: I'm not a Catholic, so I hope I'm neutral and attached in that sense. But I've always been heartened to see the Catholics and bishops stand up for all populations. Frankly, back was a big effort to pass DREAM. And Kind was a big support for that. We have Dreamers on staff. There was also a lot of behind the scenes effort, kind of trade one population for another. And one of the spots, a cloud of a Catholic Church would be making sure that everyone was protected in the vulnerable population category. And it's one of the, I've worked a lot with evangelicals over the years, and it's really broke out to see the evangelicals supporting Trump and then question not all evangelicals. Right, there's a lot of different stripes within the evangelical movement in the church, but there has been, and I haven't seen that with the Catholic. I've seen a lot of independence and still maintaining the relationships they have with Republicans and conservatives, and so I think it's important. The other thing I've seen particularly, I worked a lot on faith organizing is when you first come to, there's always this in having an interfaith or ecumenical response, which is ideal. But then when you have to go through it practically, I would do a study guide, like a Bible study guide, and then people are like, oh, we can't use that. It's got to be through our denomination. You do a Catholic social guide, you do one-to-one for. So I do think it's harder for one church to lead religious, but I think there can be a lot of loose coordination partnership. That's me as a secular guy on the outside from the NGO, my experience, but I have been really heartened to see the work of the Catholics. And I say that I grew up Protestant, not here at Notre Dame, but it's been very heartening that independence and standing up for all populations.
So I don't want to get between you and the food. There's lunch outside here. We'll be sticking people in a cup and talk individually. Thanks again for your attendance and your interest in this topic. We really, really appreciate it.
That's exactly what I was thinking. That's